I want to start with a sentence that may feel uncomfortable. Greenland is not America's obsession. It is Europe's omission. When the Trump administration talks again about taking Greenland, Europe responds with outrage, legality, and disbelief. But here's the harder truth. Power is rarely restrained by what is merely not allowed. It is restrained by what is made impossible. Look at Venezuela. Washington acted there not because it was lawful, but because it believed leverage existed, resistance was manageable, and alternatives were weak. That same logic, not rhetoric, not law, is what should concern Europe today. Greenland is protected on paper, but paper does not stop pressure. If you care about Europe's security, this is not a distant Arctic debate. It is a test of whether Europe understands the world as it is, not as it wishes it to be. Stay with me, because once you see why Greenland truly matters, you can't unsee what Europe risks losing. Let's be precise about the problem. This is not a debate about sovereignty. It is a debate about strategy. Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. It sits inside NATO. It is protected by international law. On paper, the question is settled. But strategy does not live on paper. It lives in capabilities, presence, and credible commitment. When Europe responds to American power politics by listing legal constraints, it is answering the wrong question. The real question is simpler and far more uncomfortable. Who actually guarantees security when pressure arrives? From Washington's point of view, control matters more than ownership. Influence matters more than treaties. And responsibility belongs to whoever is willing to act, not whoever is morally correct. Europe has treated Greenland as a political sensitivity, something to manage quietly, explain away diplomatically, and defend rhetorically. That approach worked in a post-Cold War world. It does not work in an era of renewed great power competition, because in this world, what is weakly defended becomes strategically tempting. And that brings us to why Greenland matters far more than Europe has been willing to admit. To understand how we arrived here, you have to look backward. For decades after the Cold War, the Arctic felt peripheral, frozen, stable, outside the main currents of history. Greenland, in that context, became less a strategic node and more a diplomatic footnote, important symbolically, inconvenient politically, and easy to ignore militarily. That assumption rested on a cycle that no longer exists, a world where Russia was weak, where China was distant, where sea routes were fixed, space uncontested, and satellites largely secure. That world is gone. As ice recedes, geography returns. The Arctic is no longer a barrier, it is a corridor. And Greenland sits directly astride one of the most sensitive choke points in the North Atlantic, the GIUK Gap through which submarines, data, and power flow. Meanwhile, Russia has rebuilt a formidable Arctic military posture. China, calling itself a near-Arctic state, is positioning for long-term influence, cooperating with Moscow on the Northern Sea route, a shorter, dual-use artery between Europe and Asia. History's mechanism is simple. When strategic environments change, neglected territory becomes leverage. And that neglect has consequences. The first shock is already visible. In June 2025, Washington quietly made a decision that should have rung alarm bells across Europe. Greenland was moved from US European Command to Northern Command. No speeches, no drama, just a structural shift. But bureaucratic changes are never just bureaucratic. This move signaled something profound. The United States no longer views Greenland as a European adjacent issue. It sees it as directly tied to American homeland defense. Early warning radar, missile tracking, satellite command and control, space, domain awareness. These are not abstract assets. They are core to how modern power survives in a contested world. From Washington's perspective, this made perfect sense. From Europe's perspective, the response was muted, and that silence matters. Because when one actor upgrades its strategic posture and others do not, a vacuum forms. Not a legal vacuum, but a strategic one. And strategic vacuums invite assumptions, pressures, and recalculations. If this feels like a technical detail, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, who is shaping reality on the ground and who is reacting after the fact? If this analysis is sharpening how you see global power, take a second to stay with this conversation. Because the real danger is not what the United States says. It's what Europe still hasn't built. What sits beneath all of this is a quieter mechanism. Power does not begin with aggression. It begins with infrastructure. Greenland's value is not symbolic. It is functional. Its geography enables early warning systems, missile tracking, satellite ground stations, and secure communications that feed directly into modern defense architectures. In an age where space and cyber domains are contested, these systems are not peripheral, they are foundational. This is why control, access, and reliability matter more than flags. From Washington's perspective, Greenland is part of an integrated security system. From Europe's perspective, it has too often been treated as an exception, something politically delicate, strategically awkward, and therefore approached cautiously. But systems do not tolerate ambiguity. If satellite tracking depends on Greenland, then Greenland cannot be loosely defended. If Arctic monitoring matters, then presence must be sustained, not symbolic. If resilience is the goal, then dependency must be reduced and redundancy built. Europe has begun to recognize this, investing in satellite communications infrastructure, reducing over-reliance on Svalbard, discussing new defensive capabilities. These are important moves, but mechanisms only work when they're complete. Partial systems create weak points. Weak points attract pressure. And pressure, once applied, rarely announces itself in advance. That brings us to the second escalation, faster, sharper, and harder to ignore. The second escalation is not a single event. It is momentum. Russia is not experimenting in the Arctic. It has already built a formidable military posture there. China is not improvising either. By declaring itself a near-Arctic state, Beijing is signaling patience, not haste, positioning for influence over time, not headlines today. Together, Moscow and Beijing are cooperating on the development of the Northern Sea Route. On the surface, it looks commercial, a shorter shipping lane between Europe and Asia, but in modern geopolitics, there is no such thing as a purely civilian corridor. Dual-use routes reshape power, access, and leverage. This is where Europe's delay becomes costly. While others build presence, Europe debates process. While others integrate Arctic strategy into national security, Europe treats the region as a niche concern. And while others think in decades, Europe moves in increments. The danger is not invasion, it is normalization. When rival powers operate, invest, and coordinate in a space long enough, their presence stops feeling provocative and starts feeling inevitable. At that point, reversing course becomes harder, riskier, and more expensive. This is how pressure accumulates without a crisis headline, and eventually it stops being about states. It becomes about people. Now bring this down to human scale, because strategy always lands somewhere, and this time it lands on you. When Greenland is treated as peripheral, the costs don't show up on maps. They show up in vulnerability, independence, in decisions made far away by people you didn't elect, under pressures you never see. If early warning systems weaken, you don't hear the silence until it matters. If satellite resilience erodes, everyday systems you rely on become fragile. If Arctic security is outsourced, Europe's strategic autonomy shrinks quietly, steadily. You are told this is abstract, technical, too complex to worry about. But security is not an abstraction. It is the background condition that makes normal life feel normal. And when Europe hesitates, others don't step back, they step in. This is the emotional core of the issue. Not fear, but responsibility. Greenland is not just a territory to be defended by rules. It is a test of whether Europe is willing to protect the conditions that keep its citizens secure in a world that no longer pauses for deliberation. If this perspective resonates, if it sharpens how you see power, stay with this analysis, share it. Because public understanding shapes political resolve. And resolve is exactly what has been missing. What happens next doesn't stop at Europe's borders. Zoom out now. Because Greenland is not an isolated chessboard. It sits inside a global system that reacts to signals. When Europe hesitates in the Arctic, the message travels far beyond the North Atlantic. It tells other powers where Europe draws its lines and where it doesn't. In geopolitics, ambiguity is read as opportunity. Control over the GIUK Gap affects more than submarines. It shapes transatlantic security, NATO credibility, and the balance of influence between Europe and North America. If Europe is absent from shaping that reality, it becomes dependent on decisions made elsewhere, by allies today, potentially by rivals tomorrow. The Arctic is also a precedent. If coercive leverage is imaginable in Greenland, it becomes imaginable elsewhere. Strategic passivity in one region bleeds into expectations in others. That is how local weaknesses become systemic risks. This is why Washington watches European behavior as closely as European statements, and why Moscow and Beijing do the same. They are not listening to speeches, they are counting assets, timelines, and commitments. Global power is not impressed by intention. It responds to alignment between words and structure. Greenland, quietly, has become a signal to the world about whether Europe can translate awareness into action. And that signal will shape the future. Which brings us to the hardest question of all. What paths lie ahead? There are three futures ahead. None of them are theoretical. The first is the strong path. Europe treats Greenland as central to its own security. Presence becomes visible. Integration becomes real. Arctic defense, space infrastructure, and monitoring of the GIUK Gap are embedded into European planning not as favors to Washington, but as acts of self-interest. In this future, coercion fades not because it is illegal, but because it is futile. The second is the managed path. Europe continues incremental investment, satellite upgrades here, defense discussions there, enough to slow erosion but not enough to close the gap. The island remains secure but dependent. Decisions are shared unevenly. Pressure is contained, not eliminated. The third is the weak path. Europe relies on rules, reassurance, and reaction. Presence remains thin. Strategy remains fragmented. Over time, others define the reality on the ground. No crisis erupts, but leverage quietly shifts away. These futures are not chosen by declarations. They are chosen by budgets, deployments, and priorities. History does not punish bad intentions. It punishes delayed ones. Which future Europe enters depends on whether it finally accepts what Greenland has become, not a liability, not a taboo, but a responsibility that cannot be deferred. And that leads us to the final insight. Let's end where we began, with power, not slogans. Greenland is not for sale, but it is also not self-defending. The lesson of Venezuela was never about legality. It was about leverage, about what happens when control appears feasible, resistance seems manageable, and alternatives look absent. Europe's mistake has been to assume that rules alone close that gap. They don't. What closes it is presence, integration, commitment that is visible enough to change calculations before pressure is applied. This is the paradox Europe must embrace. The best way to prevent American fixation on acquiring Greenland is not moral outrage, but strategic ownership of its security. A Europe that treats Greenland as central, not awkward, transforms the conversation from control to cooperation, because power respects reality, not reassurance. If you want to understand the next phase of global politics, don't watch the headlines. Watch the blind spots. They are where the future forms first. If this analysis helped you see one more clearly, stay with this channel, share this conversation. The next video will explore another place where law still speaks loudly, but power is already moving. And this time, the stakes may be even closer to home.